well, thanks everyone for coming. I think I'll just start off by asking, first of all, is anyone here pro-Biden? It's fine to be. So, is anyone unsure? No, okay, so we're all pretty on the anti-Biden vote. Okay, that's good. So I won't be changing any minds tonight, obviously, but maybe I'll I guess I'll begin by talking about a young, brash 29-year-old senator from Delaware in 1972, or a Senate candidate rather, in 1972. This candidate was propelled by a youth movement. A lot of young people got behind him. He led in small donations. He outraised his challenger. Was a very powerful Delaware politician who'd been governor, congressman, senator since 1946. He outraised them in small donations. He took a very forthright stance against the Vietnam War. Wanted to withdraw troops as quickly as possible, within reason. He ended up winning the black vote against this very powerful senator, despite the fact that no one knew who he was, and he was, again, 29 years old. And actually, the senator had a pretty good civil rights record. It was actually endorsed by the first black senator in U.S. history. And he ended up winning by 3,000 votes. That was in 1972. 6 years later, that senator, who had run a campaign that was very much economically populist in 1972, railing against how big money controlled both parties and calling for social security increases and caps on prices and interest rates and all the like, and calling for a consumer protection agency. By 1978, that young politician had changed completely. By 1978, he was now calling for a massive tax cut. He was saying that he was a fiscal conservative. He was calling for a ceiling on the federal bureaucracy of employment. He was putting forward a measure that was going to sunset basically every single federal program, unless it was sort of individually, each program was individually renewed every 7 years, and so on and so forth. Whereas in 72, he had said some not great things about busing, but actually voted pretty much pro-busing all the way, just sort of masked it under anti-busing rhetoric. By 1978, between 75 and 78, he cast 19 anti-busing votes and only one pro-busing vote. So he changed very completely. Obviously, we're all here. I asked you a question about Joe Biden. You know what the book is. This is obviously talking about Joe Biden. The question is, why did Joe Biden, who is this young sort of, if you look at the rhetoric that he was using in 72, it doesn't sound that far off from the kind of stuff Bernie Sanders is saying now. So what led Joe Biden to go from this kind of seemingly very forthright New Deal liberal to suddenly, someone who doesn't sound that different from Ronald Reagan in 1978 in the mere 6 years? And that's sort of that really forms the core of the kind of discussion that we're going to be having and what we're going to be talking to you about. Because the story of Joe Biden is not just about Joe Biden, who, despite having a long career, is, to some extent kind of not a particularly notable senator. I think people didn't really even realize how ubiquitous he was in so many of these kind of far-reaching measures through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, until he became vice president. And even then, people didn't know. But in some ways, people didn't really know that much about him, and aside from the fact that he's running for president, and may even drop out, as far as we can see, pretty soon, depending on how South Carolina goes. His story is very much, rather than a story about a unique singular politician, it is a story about the Democratic Party sort of across the 20th century, and particularly in the last 30, 40 years. And not just that, but the story of kind of American liberalism in that time as well. So I guess just to begin, I'm sure everyone already knows this, but I'll just kind of go over it. The sort of the history of the political landscape in the U.S. Over the course of the 20th century. Very broad terms. It'll be kind of reductive, but largely accurate. Historians refer to the period between about the 30s to the 70s as the liberal consensus, the so-called liberal consensus. Obviously, it's a bit simplified because even in 1947, you have the Taft-Hartley Act passes, which is anti-union legislation that really kind of calls back some of the gains made during the New Deal. You have McCarthyism, civil rights doesn't really get anywhere for a long time. So there's a lot of things that we could point to sort of say there's an exception to this consensus. But on the whole, you look at when Dwight Eisenhower takes power, Republican, 1952, the first Republican in the New Deal era to take power. A lot of people on the radical right were saying to him, hey, okay, now it's our chance to kind of cut a lot of these things and take out some of these things that were done during the New Deal, like Social Security. And Eisenhower says to that, well, if I do that, that is political suicide. That's the end of my career. That's the end of the Republican Party. So part of this liberal consensus is, and I would say any political consensus, is not just that it's the fact that voters vote a certain way, but it's also that even the opposition party sort of sacrifices some of its ideals and kind of moves closer to the other side out of political expediency and perhaps out of genuine concern for these particular things. And then obviously you have Carter comes in 1976, and he's sort of the first blow against the New Deal to some extent. He's a conservative Democrat, doesn't like government spending, deregulates a bunch of industries. And then you have Reagan, and by the point Reagan comes in, that's when you really start to see the kind of end of this New Deal era. Now, Biden's career basically straddles this kind of this transformation, from New Deal liberalism, where even though it wasn't nearly as radical as things that were happening in Europe, still there was a kind of broad commitment to the American welfare state and to the idea that government could do something to make people's lives better. And this kind of goes away by the 80s. And we'll talk about why that is, and how that, I guess, impacted Joe Biden and how he reflects that. I'll start off by giving you a little background on Joe Biden's early life, because I feel like it's quite key. Where Joe Biden grew up and the kind of conditions he grew up in is key to sort of understanding some of his later politics. So Biden's born in 1942. This is after the Depression. It is in the middle of World War II. It's smack dab in the middle of that liberal consensus that we're talking about, perhaps at its height. He comes from a middle to working class family, depending on what period of time we're talking about. The family goes through ups and downs. His family benefited from the New Deal and from the sort of era of big government. His family, Joe Sr. did very well during the war because he was brought into his uncle's business. His uncle was in business selling armor plate to merchant marine vessels that were crossing the Atlantic during the war. Really dangerous, obviously. And actually, there's a law passed to mandate that their armor is used on these ships, and so things go very well. He buys lots of toys for his young son, and sort of wooden horses and all this kind of stuff. At this point, after that, once the war's over, and so you don't have the kind of government largesse feeding into Biden's family anymore, things go a little worse. Not really because of Biden's dad. He kind of just has bad luck. He gets into business with some bad business partners who, whether it's a friend of his who just one day takes off and, basically steals a bunch of stuff from their furniture store that they were opening and just absconds. Or you have his partner in this kind of crop dusting business who just basically ends up being completely unreliable and the business collapses. And because of that, they have to end up moving to Joe's wife's family. They're there for a while. Then eventually, after some time, they moved to a suburb of Wilmington, Delaware in 1955, which is populated by employees of DuPont. And as a sidebar, DuPont is one of it's probably the preeminent economic power and political power in Delaware. The family has just been there for generations, and the chemical company has just sort of dominated the state for many, many years. And interestingly enough, two of its executives were sort of on the ground floor in the kind of business campaign against the New Deal order that springs up in the about the 1930s and 40s, basically as soon as the New Deal's happening. So I think that's kind of an interesting little point. So Biden moves to the suburbs, and he recalls in his autobiography, he says, as he reflects on this time, he says, quote, "America seemed to be remaking itself for our post-war generation. There were new houses, new schools, new car models, new gadgets, new televisions, and new television shows with people who look just like us." So obviously, there's a lot to unpack there, especially with the "look just like us" comment. But the key, I think, thing about that is that the way Biden presents it, and I'm not sure if he knows better or if he just sort of is presenting it this way, but he kind of makes this suburban prosperity and the post-war prosperity that he grew up in, he makes it seem like it's sort of just sprung up an accident. As if somebody, took a bag of magic beans and spread them out, and suddenly there was suburbia and television shows and prosperity. And of course, that wasn't the case. Biden neglects to mention that this was underwritten by government programs that were both guaranteeing people's economic security during the Depression and after, and also that the suburban construction boom was underwritten by the government, but in a way where it wasn't obvious that the government was underwriting it. And so people came away from it going, this is just sort of, we did this ourselves. We didn't need the government for this. And of course, yes, this is also, this suburban construction boom is very racist. Obviously, African Americans are excluded from it. And that's sort of the other element of this whole thing, which is that another key to understanding Biden's history and his politics is that he's in Delaware. Delaware is technically a northern state, and I mean, it is, but it also kind of straddles the Mason-Dixon line, so both figuratively and literally. And to give you some examples, Delaware, it was a former slave state. It took until 1901 to ratify the 13th Amendment, which is the one that banned slavery. So they took their time on that one. Biden kind of reflects on this later, and he says, I had just assumed everyone treated everyone fairly. He sort of didn't realize that there was all this stuff happening. And he later says that it was only once he worked as a lifeguard. Everyone's heard the corn pop story, right? So that was the awakening for him. Yeah. I was also surprised that corn pop was a real guy. I thought for a long time he was fake, but it turns out he's a real dude. There's a lot of other stuff. Wilmington public schools were designed to be unequally funded. It's in law that African American schools just are supposed to get less funding than white schools. There's urban renewal, which means a lot of African American communities are being displaced by sort of slum clearance, stuff that's meant to revitalize the inner city. There's a battle over the construction of a highway through the city, because a lot of people that live in the city are worried that this is going to clear out whole neighborhoods. But obviously for suburbanites who are predominantly white, who kind of escape the inner city and go to the suburbs, they see it as a way to basically skip over the inner city, which is crumbling and poverty, and also populated by African Americans. This is the 40s and 50s. So I argue that this kind of creates Biden's focus on the middle class, which ends up kind of defining his politics for basically his entire career. And we'll get into, when he talks about the middle class, which really becomes the be-all and end-all of everything that Biden does, he has a very particular conception of the middle class, and we'll talk about that. And the other key to mention, which I won't really have time to go into, but if anyone wants to ask me a question about it afterwards, okay, is that everyone knows Biden is Irish. He makes sure that you know it. He always mentions it. He mentions the word malarkey. It's on his bus. Biden's not that Irish. I don't know, whether he sort of plays this up or it's just this cultural thing that he imbues. But either way, it's clear that his conception of himself as Irish and the kind of stories he hears as a kid kind of shape his worldview. He gets told by his Irish aunt about his dad. She says, your father's not a bad man, he's just English. And for the rest of his life, and comments here and there, Biden will make points about, for example, when he was Obama's point man in Iraq, he was talking about sectarianism in Iraq, and his plan was just to separate everyone, segregate them. And actual Middle East experts told him, this is not the way to go. Middle East experts, Iraqis rather, they want to get past sectarianism, they want to leave it behind. And he says to her in this meeting, you don't know these people. I know the Irish and the English and the Bosnians and the Serbs, they're just never going to live together. These people can't live together. You have to separate. So I think that he really does kind of internalize this lesson that he takes from his family mythology. And actually there's a later when he's in the middle of kind of opposing busing, he says at a 975 South Carolina fundraiser, he talks about the idea that America is strong because it's a great melting pot. And he says, quote, "That is just a bunch of poppycock, because we know being black and white and Christian and Jew breaks us apart." So he sort of buys into this idea that just, people's ethnic, religious, racial differences just make them incapable of living together and cohabiting with us. Biden enters politics at pretty much every presidential candidate that we're seeing on stage now and in the years previous, where it was something that he has eye on from when he was a kid, and even as a young man meeting his in-laws, he would tell them, I'm going to be president, I'm going to be Santa. He freely admits later that he only went into law school because it was a road to a political career, as he saw it. I think it's very different, style politician like that. You got Biden, you got Obama, also, similarly planned his presidency from young adulthood. Someone like Pete Buttigieg as well. A lot of these people, they plan it from the beginning. And I think there's a difference between a candidate like that, where everything is about getting to a certain place and about achieving a status and saying that I managed to get this, and everything becomes a compromise to get there, because that's the goal. And it's different from someone, say, like candidates like Warren or Sanders, who I think never really imagined that they would even have a shot at being president. Maybe they thought they could run, but I don't think either of them thought that they could actually, potentially win and really have actual tangible goals they want to achieve. So I think that's an important distinction to note. He is an independent until 21. He's courted by the Republicans for a little while, but until ultimately he becomes a Democrat in 1969. And a state Democratic Party chair later says, quote, "He had lots of energy and idealism and was always assertive, but to my knowledge, he had no substantive ideology." He's a county councilman first. He only does it for a year. Then the Republicans kind of plot to redistrict him out of the seat. And he ends up running for Senate. And that's the reason he runs for Senate is partly because no one else wants to, because Caleb Boggs, Caleb Boggs, the senator that he ends up beating, is, as I mentioned before, very beloved and well-known and powerful. He's been in power for ages. No one can beat him. No Democrat can beat him. And I think Biden says, I'm going to give him 5-1 odds of winning. But I think he runs to kind of raise his profile, as a lot of people do. And he says, the only thing I want to be known for in politics is that I'm totally honest, a man of my word. And he also says, Samuel Clemens said, all generalizations are untrue, including this one. And keeping that in mind, I'm a liberal Democrat. So this is sort of sets a pattern of Biden kind of running away from the label of liberal. He doesn't want to be labeled liberal, I think partly because of the particular political environment he's running in, and he has to hold power in. So we talked about the 1972 campaign, again, strangely economically populist campaign. That does not really fit with the Biden that we know now. And then again, 6 years later, he has completely switched. So what causes the switch? I argue it's a couple of things. One is in 1978, the same year that he's running for re-election, that, at the back of his mind, he knows that he had already beaten this guy once and had come out of nowhere to do it and surprised everyone. And he knows that could happen again. And so that could easily happen to him. At the same time, in 1978, you have the taxpayers' revolt, which leads to the passage of Proposition 13 in California, which Californians are currently trying to get rid of, or at least change somewhat. Makes it a lot harder to levy taxes, and it's sort of born out of this frustration that a lot of suburban middle and upper middle class people have around the decade of the 70s. Is, you see inflation and recession and everything. People's paychecks start to mean a lot less than they used to. It's going to the grocery store is tough, and people are kind of pissed off because they're at the same time they're also paying these high taxes, and they don't think it's fair because all those taxes are being used to basically help other people, other people, and so there's this rebellion, the suburban rebellion against taxes that starts in California and kind of spreads like a wildfire across the U.S. Over the 3 years after 78, 18 states put limits on taxes or government spending that are kind of similar to California's Proposition 13. So that's the first thing. And I think Biden learns a lesson in this campaign. He realizes, whereas in the first campaign he had run mostly on small donors and he got union backing, he this time, I think, gets worried. He's sort of testy with reporters in advance. They ask him, where do you fall in the political spectrum? And he says, what kind of question is that? Am I beating my wife? So he's very, clearly very agitated about where he fits in this new political environment that's slowly turning to the right. And he learns the lesson that because ultimately what he ends up doing in 1978 is he ends up raising a lot of money from big business and sort of wealthy donors, the kind of donors that 6 years earlier he had said, I don't want to prostitute myself to these donors, and he had said, these donors came up to me one time and they asked me, are you serious about raising the capital gains tax? And I knew what I was supposed to say if I was going to take their money. So he made a big deal about that. By 78, he's decided that he will take the money after all. But it doesn't really matter because he still gets very strong African-American support. He still gets union support, even though he's allying himself with big business and wealthy donors. A lot of those donors are actually coming from California, the epicenter of the taxpayers' revolt. They're giving to Biden. And he realizes, and this becomes the Democratic playbook, not necessarily because people looked at Biden and said, let's do this, but it's just, it does become the Democratic playbook to, the old hostage situation, right? The left, liberals, progressives, whatever, they don't have anyone else to vote for, so they have to vote for you. And if there's a big bad scary Republican here, well, what are you going to do? You're going to not vote for the guy who votes for you, maybe 70% of the time, and maybe votes against you on some big issues, but for most of it, he's good. And that really becomes a pattern for the rest of Biden's career. For the rest of his career, whenever he's faced by a Republican, whether a sort of moderate one or a scary right-wing one, his playbook is to, instead of running that economic populist campaign that he first ran, he basically just moves to the right, tries to take a bunch of the other guy's platform, and then sees if he can basically squeeze through with winning some Republican voters and also getting liberals and that kind of thing. And it works. He basically wins by around the same margin, for the rest of his career. Which kind of brings to the question of, was it really necessary for him to move to the right? Who knows? I think that's a fair thing to question. Obviously, we can't know counterfactuals. It also leads to disaster because for a while this doesn't matter because he can just sort of pretend to do this stuff at least for the election and then kind of move back a little more to the liberal side afterwards. But in 2002, he gets faced by this very right-wing Republican called Ray Clatworthy, who's a businessman, who's the first opponent he's ever faced who can really match him in fundraising. And he happens to be a huge supporter of the Iraq War. You can see where this is going. So through 2002, Biden looks at the electoral landscape and he looks at the attacks from Ray Clatworthy and he looks at Bush's popularity and he says to himself, okay, I clearly have to support the Iraq War because otherwise, this guy can destroy me. And Biden spends the whole of 2002 really being the chief architect, at least on the Democratic side, of the Iraq War. He's the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. He gives voices to these people who are pro-Iraq war, who are saying that Saddam is allied with Al-Qaeda and stuff. He goes on the news shows and says, something has to be done about Saddam, yada, yada, yada. So this lesson in the long term has really terrible consequences. That's one election. There's other ones that we'll get to later on. The other thing that happens is in the 80s is Reagan. So Carter was that first blow, and then Carter is wiped off the map by Reagan, who wins. I can't remember the exact margin, but he wins, I think, 44 states. So it's a landslide victory for Reagan. And Reagan was the Trump of his time. He was a scary right-wing Republican. He was endorsed twice by the Klan. People forget that. He accused people of being communists. He sort of wanted to go to war with the entire world. He shouldn't have won. The fact that he won was inconceivable. He was an actor. That's the other thing. He was an entertainer. And that really changes the entire electoral calculus for Democrats and for people like Biden. And Biden says when Reagan is elected, he says, well, that election, quote, is more consistent with the budgetary thrust that a guy like me has been going for the past few years. And, he thinks to himself, maybe I can actually work and do some stuff here, because Reagan also wants to cut taxes and cut spending and so on and so forth. So first is Reagan's tax cut, which was first actually put forward by Democrats, and Reagan actually initially rejected it. So the Democrats are sort of trying to, in this new landscape, trying to sort of out the Republicans. That's their playbook. The tax cut passes. Biden votes for it. It balloons the deficit, which then becomes the reason to then go after government spending and start cutting things there. So the next thing that happens is Reagan's first budget in 1981, which Biden and 29 other Democrats vote for. It cuts the sewer programs and throws people off various government programs that they were depending on to live. The New York Times calls this budget, quote, a triumph for conservatives rivaling the liberal triumphs of Lyndon Johnson and Franklin Roosevelt. So, the New Deal and the Great Society. The Washington Post says that the budget's passage marks, quote, the reversal of two great waves of government intervention, the Great Society and New Deal. So this is sort of the beginning of the rollback of the New Deal, and this kind of continues through the 80s and the 90s. At the same time that Reagan's huge victories are making Democrats question who they are and what they should be doing, there are several business-backed initiatives to push the Democratic Party to the right. So you have, in charge of the DCCC, the fundraising arm of House Democrats, is a guy called Tony Coelho, who opens the party's fundraising to venture capitalists and oil producers and arms manufacturers, and basically everyone he says that the party, quote, kicked away in the 1970s. Lobbyists and lawyers start going to DCCC fundraisers, and it's sort of told that they can get access. You have the Democratic Leadership Council, which gets established after Walter Mondale's loss in 1984. Bill Clinton was famously the chair of the Democratic Leadership Council, the DLC. And this is another corporate-backed initiative to push the Democratic Party to the right, to make it more like more like Republicans, and more specifically like Reagan Republicans. Through the 80s, Biden tours the country with the DLC, basically lecturing Democrats that they have to change, that they can't keep doing the same thing that they were doing. In North Carolina, for instance, he says, quote, the party has lost its way. You have been where the Democratic Party was, and now the Democratic Party must be where you are. He says at one point that the party would be, quote, much better off if the DLC chair, Chuck Robb, who was a Southern conservative Democrat, if he ran for president. And he says things like this throughout his tour of the South. I think it's key to note that obviously the South is crucial for U.S. politics in general and governing. It's certainly for the Democratic Party. It certainly was in the New Deal because of just the way the U.S. system is designed. And Roosevelt, in fact, actually, also depended on the South. He, however, tried to change Southern politics. He tried to kind of campaign against the Southern politicians who were standing in his way, who were opposed to some of these New Deal programs, and who were a block on passing civil rights legislation, but he failed. And the South kind of remained a political backwater, basically, for the next whatever decades. Biden's message is different. He's not saying that we have to change the South. He's saying the party has to change to be like the South, specifically like the conservative white South is what he's thinking of. At about the same time as he's touring with the DLC and as he starts gearing up for his own presidential run, like a lot of other Democrats, and this is rhetoric that is, again, not unique to Biden. A lot of people start talking like this. Biden is talking a lot about the middle class. For example, he had said earlier, quote, "When you lose support of that great unwashed middle class of which I'm a part, no social policy in this country will move." And as I will demonstrate in a second, the middle class becomes the be-all and end-all, becomes the justification for everything he does and everything he doesn't do. So whenever he wants to pass something that is maybe controversial, he says, well, the middle class needs this. Whenever he wants to avoid doing something or has to explain why he didn't do something, it's also because of the middle class. There's this famous quote, well, maybe not famous to me, I have it nearly memorized, where he talks about why he wasn't in the anti-war protests when he was a student, because he talked a lot about being an anti-war protester through his congressional career. Eventually, one of the reasons he had to drop out in 1987 was because the press found out that he had never actually marched against the war. That he had actually been sort of maybe even pro-war for a little while. And then he has to explain himself to the press, and he says something like, I think I have it here actually. Yes, he says, quote, "By the time the war movement was at its peak, I was married. I was in law school. I wore sports coats. You're looking at a middle-class guy. I'm not big on flak jackets and tie-dye shirts." It's absurd, but this is his explanation. Excuse me, sorry, I'm getting over a cold. He complains in his first campaign that the middle class is under attack from the rich and the poor. In 1977, he says, actually, no, I'll come back to that quote in a second. This kind of focus on the middle class continues well past the 70s and the 80s into the 90s while he's in the middle of fighting for a fifth term. He tells a group of Democrats about the Clinton administration, quote, "It's the middle class, stupid. It's the middle class. They are the beginning, the middle, and the end of the political viability of this government." In 2016, even, Biden is looking back at the disaster of Hillary Clinton's election, and he's trying to explain why she lost. And he quite correctly says, she was just talking about Trump and how she was experienced and credentialed and everything, but not so much about the pain of ordinary people. And he says, quote, "You didn't hear a word about the husband and wife working, making maybe $100,000 a year, 2 kids struggling and scared to death." And he says this used to be our most loyal constituency. Now, obviously, a household making $100,000 a year isn't breaking it in or anything, but it's also important to note that at this time, the median annual household income is $57,617, so nearly half of that. And also, I mean, if you look at any basic, polling and surveys and everything, the people who are most loyal Democrats are the people, or at least vote Democrat, are making fractions of that. Way less. But again, Biden's conception of the middle class is very specific. And at the same time, in the 80s, as he's railing against the middle class, he's talking about the need to protect the middle class. He starts talking about special interests and interest groups and how they're a threat to the middle class, which isn't really that unusual. Roosevelt talked about how special interests were dominating politics. We hear it now, obviously, all the time. But the thing that people were calling special interests in the 1980s was very different to what we think of now. We think of it as big business and lobbyists and that kind of thing. I'll give you a few quotes and I'll let you sort of figure out what Biden might be referring to when he says special interests. But so, for example, in 1977, he says, quote, "All of us can take the heat from the special interest groups if we've got the support of the middle class guy." He says after Reagan's victory, his first victory, he says, quote, "For 13 years, I've been trying to move the Democratic Party off the course it's been on. I said what nobody else was saying. The interest groups have a stranglehold on us, and number 2, there's a whole generation of Americans ready to move." Now, everybody says those things. He says, quote, "The middle class doesn't belong to any particular interest group." he blames, in 1979, he blames interest groups for basically growing the federal budget because they refuse to do away with government programs that they benefit from. So we're getting a little warmer to figuring out what this means. If we go back to 1971, in this case, he's not railing against interest groups, but he does say, quote, "Minorities and other vested interests are sick and tired of hollow promises." He says at one point, while he's doing this whole tour, he often contradicts himself. So at one point he's actually defending interest groups. So he says, quote, "All the talk about us having to shed ourselves to control a special interest misses the point." Then the very next minute he says, "I'm proud to be in a party that has garnered the support of the majority of Black Americans." And then in 1986, he tells the NAACP convention, quote, "You can't try to pit the Rainbow Coalition, Blacks, Hispanics, poor whites, gays, against the middle class." So I hope by kind of giving this layout of quotes, though, you're sort of seeing what he means when he says the middle class and special interests and interest groups. He's thinking of very specific things. Special interests are not big business and lobbyists and all these kind of moneyed interests. They are the various marginalized groups that came under the big tent that the Democratic Party had built. African Americans, LGBTQ people, Latinos. Poor people. Yeah, labor. That's right. Labor is a big one. He sort of hedges on that one. He kind of said, well, because he still needs labor support, so he doesn't quite want to go all the way there. But he does, while he's at the same time doing this, he does do speaking in front of labor groups, and he's telling them, you guys have got to change. You're getting too much. You're too comfortable. You have to change how you do things. At the same time, his conception of the middle class, I would argue, is I think he is thinking of that Delaware, that Wilmington, suburban, white, conservative middle class that voted for Nixon and that voted for Reagan. These are the people that Biden grew up around and lived around, even though he did have a lot of support among African Americans. And I think for him, these are the people that are going to swing either way, and that you have to sort of win over to get your political project off the ground. For the next little while, what this translates into is through the 90s with Clinton's election, and Clinton's another Biden-esque candidate who started out as a progressive, was basically beaten by the powerful industries in his state, and then came back and sort of decided, I'll play ball because that's the only way to get things done. And he, he becomes the kind of probably the finest proponent of triangulation in the Democrats, moving to the center, trying to take some of those Republican positions, depriving the Republicans of oxygen. And so with Clinton in power, you have a whole series of measures passed with the help of Clinton, Biden, and a whole bunch of other Democrats, and Republicans, of course, in large numbers, that lead to these right-wing victories that, in the long term, eviscerate a lot of the voting base for Democrats, blue-collar workers and African Americans, throws a lot of people into poverty, makes them apathetic and disengaged from politics. They decide, what's the point? Or they decide, the Democratic Party has betrayed us. You have NAFTA that passes. Biden, despite doing a speech on the Senate floor, basically chiding or even haranguing, you might say, his fellow lawmakers for sort of dismissing Labor's concerns about NAFTA. He says, how dare we tell these people that they're being over the top. Nonetheless, he votes for it anyway, and it's a typical Biden politician move. You have welfare reform, which Biden was a key figure in. He actually was invited to the signing ceremony, and that sort of shows you how important he was to that effort. And welfare reform, reform, quote unquote, leads to the really the evisceration and disappearance of welfare across the South and Southwest, because it goes up to the states to decide what they want to do with this money for welfare. And a lot of states that are governed by conservative legislatures or governors decide, well, we'll just use this money to plug up holes in the budget, or we'll put it to something else. We won't use it for welfare because we don't believe in it. So it's a disaster for people. You have a 999. You have Glass-Steagall passes, which of course has disastrous consequences 9 years down the line in the form of the. It doesn't cause the Wall Street crash, but it does make it much more severe. You have, by the end of Clinton's 2 terms, at a point when he's balanced the budget, which is this great achievement in Washington, and and so cut spending and everything. Again, very popular among columnists for major newspapers and magazines, not so much popular among actual ordinary people. But the result of that is, and Biden backs all of this all the way, is by the end of the 2 terms of Clinton, federal spending falls to its lowest level since 1966, and the federal workforce becomes the smallest percentage of overall employment since before Roosevelt took office. So symbolically, sort of the sun setting on the New Deal era. Reagan really set the end of the New Deal in motion, and it was Clinton, a Democrat, an FDR Democrat, who brings it to a close. And this continues. Biden in 2005 passes the bankruptcy bill, which we've heard so much about. Later on, as vice president, Biden's put to the task by Obama to talk to Mitch McConnell and negotiate with him around cutting spending. And of course, Biden just basically becomes a doormat and just allows Mitch McConnell anything and everything. So much so that he becomes the go-to guy whenever negotiations have to begin. Mitch McConnell calls up Biden instead of Harry Reid. He's like, "Hey, let's you and I do business," because he knows that Biden will just let him walk all over him. And I guess the sum total of this is it really leads up to 2016, where you have, the reason Trump, this oafish, repellent, right-wing demagogue wins, again, much like Reagan, a guy who was never supposed to win. On every level, it seemed inconceivable that this guy could beat anyone, let alone Hillary Clinton, who was a sort of centrist, experienced establishment choice. Theoretically, the one who should have won. Trump wins for a number of reasons. The Democrats, by that point, because of Biden and people like him, had betrayed a lot of their past positions, whether on foreign policy or on trade, even Medicare and Social Security. People forget that Trump ran, it was bullshit, but he ran promising to protect Medicare and Social Security. Trump was able to run to the left of Clinton on certain key respects, even if he was being disingenuous. And so he was able to poach maybe some of these voters who may have been loyal Democrats, may have considered voting Democrat, but instead saw him as a kind of more of a fighter for ordinary American workers. At the same time, the evisceration of the middle and working class had happened a lot, in large part because of stuff Biden had done. Look at the bankruptcy bill or welfare reform or NAFTA, means an even more apathetic populace that when Clinton comes on the scene, turnout drops, African-American turnout drops for the first time in 20 years, or its lowest point in 20 years. People stay home. There was a great New York Times article that interviewed people in a suburb in Milwaukee, in this African-American neighborhood, asking them if they voted, and they say basically no. Why? These people never do anything for us. Nothing changes. What's the point? I don't like either of these people. And you get a right-wing, authoritarian that comes to power. Now, with this election, we're at a bit of a crossroads. And to some extent, I certainly thought that 2016 had kind of killed the establishment centrist case for electability because Clinton lost to Trump so shockingly. But we're not there yet. And I think at this point, the Democratic Party and its voters are kind of having to choose between two directions. On the one hand, you have Biden and sort of, people like him, the other candidates like him, sort of like, Gizmo and Gremlins, if you've seen that movie, where, he spits out lots of little versions of himself. And all these candidates on stage, like Buttigieg, Klobuchar, so on and so forth, they are very much in the mold of Biden, maybe not consciously, but that is the same kind of, they're cut from the same cloth. The idea is that you can only win by winning over moderate voters or swing voters with, kind of Republican light policies, or at the very least, by being very timid in the kind of things you propose. On the other hand, you have people like Sanders and Warren who are putting forward very different, much more bold proposals, much more in the kind of same cloth of the New Deal, and Roosevelt wanting to sort of continue that work and arguing that it's about exciting people and getting the Democratic base out and getting them to vote. So that's sort of the the thing we're looking at now. And, you know, we don't know how Biden's going to do. He's done terribly, obviously. If he does well in South Carolina, he'll probably be able to keep going for a while. Obviously, the game for him and everyone else is just to stick around for as long as possible and try and get picked by the party and superdelegates come the convention. But the choice is, do you go for Biden's politics, the politics that have prevailed for the past 40 years, the politics that have created the kind of broken road leading up to Trump, or do you pick a different kind of politics, the politics that the Democratic Party used to stand for, that Joe Biden used to stand for? And I guess we'll find out by the end of July if which way the party has chosen. But yeah. And that's that. Probably break the time.
Good. Okay.
I don't know. Are there any questions anyone has? Yep.
Do you have any theory about who the superdelegates would pick?
I mean, they have a tough choice because on the one hand, there's Biden. Biden would seem the clear choice because he, despite his decades of betraying the voters that are most loyal to him in the Democratic Party, he still gets a lot of support from mostly older African Americans, which the other candidates don't. I mean, Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar, Elizabeth Warren. I mean, Warren's not the same as them, but you know, in terms of the non-Sanders people, none of these people can really get voters of color. Biden can. On the other hand, Biden is also, you know, I don't think, you know, I'm saying anything too controversial here. He's obviously just cognitively not up to the job anymore. It's been very clear. People are noticing it. You know, nobody wants to talk about it, but privately, people realize that, you know, putting a guy like that against Trump in the debates, who can sometimes barely string together a coherent sentence, is potentially a very good gift to Trump, and a big risk. Not to mention the Ukraine stuff, which is a whole other matter. But, you know, that scandal is just waiting to be relitigated. On the other hand, you know, there's Michael Bloomberg, but that's a big risk as well, because Bloomberg is everything that Trump is, but I guess in a sort of democratic clothing, where, you know, he's an authoritarian, misogynistic, racist, you know, instituted a kind of mini police state in New York. Not exactly great for the party if they want to draw a distinction and say, or, you know, beyond that, to even bring out voter turnout. Again, there's Pete Buttigieg. I feel like that's another possibility, but he doesn't have support among voters of color, and his sort of triangulating and his very just transparent, going wherever the sort of donors tell him to go, is another risk. So there's not really any good choice for them, I think. You know, they're reluctant to go for Sanders, obviously, but they may well, by the end of it, depends on how the primary goes. If Sanders really ends up blowing out every single primary, or at least winning every single primary, they may be forced to. And I think part of that, if they are forced to go for Sanders, if he doesn't win a majority, it will only be because there'll be a grassroots uprising come the convention, you know, similar to 2016, but much bigger. I think the superdelegates will probably look at the possible futures that are involved, and they'll look at the fact that, okay, if we take the nomination away from Sanders, if he does indeed do very well, and we basically say, hey, all that primary stuff, all that voting you guys did, all that organization you did, doesn't matter. We can just sweep it away whenever we want and just pick whoever. That would probably destroy the party, and there would be no chance, I think, or there'd be very little chance that they would get things together to actually beat Trump. The question is, you know, would they care? You know, I am certain that there are some people in the Democratic establishment, you know, that would probably prefer to just have Trump for another 4 years because they can basically run opposition, reap donations and everything, and sort of not have to really do anything or govern, which I think appealing to some people. But I think there are genuinely people in the Democratic Party who do want to beat Trump and want to get rid of him. So I haven't really answered your question because I can't know. But I think those are sort of the various possibilities. That's sort of the choices that are before them. And like I said, there's nothing really good for them there.
Yeah, would you talk a little bit about the credit card companies in Delaware and how they're involved with Biden's career?
Yeah. So
Delaware is notoriously the place where a lot of corporations have their charters because Delaware has good rules, and that's why all the credit card companies are there.
Yeah, exactly. So the bankruptcy bill, which was pushed by credit card companies, was also pushed by Joe Biden, and there's a very simple equation for this. MBNA, which is a credit card company based in Delaware, it was Biden's biggest donor. I think throughout his entire career, his biggest single donor. His son was hired by MBNA, I believe, as a lobbyist. Eventually, he sort of rose through the ranks. And this sort of is part of a pattern in Biden's career. I didn't go into it in this talk, but Biden's family has really been making money off him his entire life. His brother and his son specifically. That's sort of Biden's biggest weakness is he can't seem to say no to his family, even though they make things very difficult for him. Delaware is kind of becomes this white collar, a hub for white collar jobs on the back of the fact that it is a tax haven, and it's very good for corporations to incorporate there, even though they don't have physical locations there. And Biden really fights for this. There's I mentioned it in the book, but at one point. Congress wants to change this to weaken Delaware's laws that are so friendly to corporations, and Biden kicks up such a fuss that the guy who's pushing it just says, "Okay, all right, I'm backing off." And that bankruptcy bill that gets passed in 2005, which is that's the bill that launched Elizabeth Warren's career because it was so destructive to so many middle class families. It makes things much harder. At a time that credit card debt in the 90s is just going up and up. This is becoming more and more the cause of bankruptcy for a lot of middle class families. The very middle class that Biden's kind of fetishized throughout his entire career. And he pushes this bill, and it's a lot harder for people to declare bankruptcy. It makes it even harder for students to declare bankruptcy over student loans. Even bankruptcy judges themselves, talk about how terrible the law is and how they say, this is written in haste and it's just terrible. So that's I don't know if I've answered your question. I hope I have. Basically, there's a straight link from Biden getting these donations, and obviously MBNA really trying to. Hiring his family and everything to him passing this bill that directly serves credit card companies. It's probably one of the clearest cases of sort of the corruption in campaign donations that you can find. Yeah.
Could you talk about Biden's influence on some of Obama's foreign policy?
Yeah. Well, so I think this really Biden being picked by Obama as not just as vice president, but also as sort of his guy on foreign policy really should have been the first sign that not everything was right with Obama, or that Obama wasn't quite the progressive that he campaigned as, because Obama ran in 2008 very much against Biden's foreign policy. Biden had voted for the Iraq War, and he had helped to actually make it a thing that happened, and Obama, at one point, even in a debate, says something along the lines of, he's getting criticized by Biden and a bunch of other people, Clinton, for, having a much more progressive view on withdrawing from Iraq. And he says, I'm getting attacked by people who have basically caused the disaster of the last, 6 years or 5 years. And he gets applauded by the audience in the Democratic debate. And then, a few months later, he picks one of these guys to run his foreign policy. Actually, both of them. He picks Clinton and Biden. Supposedly Biden was picked because of his foreign policy acumen, which again sounds absurd, but the fact that he was set up as, basically running Obama's foreign policy suggests that they genuinely thought that, his experience in foreign policy was an asset. Biden's foreign policy under the Obama administration is that it's good and bad. On the bad side, he's involved in Iraq and very much pushing that idea of we have to segregate people, and he helps prop up the authoritarian candidate who running, because he sees him as a reliable, strong leader, even if he's very repressive and everything, which leads to bad cascading effects down the line. He's also involved in Ukraine, which obviously we've heard everything about. He pushes for kind of a more harsher stance toward Russia, which Obama doesn't really go for, but he sometimes undercuts the administration's attempts to kind of reset relations with Russia. That's not really in the book, unfortunately. I had to cut a bunch of things. He's also, one of the things that was supposed to be great about Biden was that he had this long relationship with Israel. Biden had actually run in '87. Most of his donations came from pro-Israel donors and lobbyists. He had long-standing ties and relationships with them. And this was, he was really one of the most obsequiously pro-Israel people in Congress for throughout the 80s and 90s. Even people who were pro-Israel were kind of like, thought he was laying it on thick. And so the idea was that now that he was in power, he would be, he would have a good relationship with Netanyahu, and it didn't change anything at all. So in many ways, Biden, those are the bad things. I guess the good things, which didn't end up being effective, but the good things, despite really having a foreign policy that was very interventionist from the 80s and the 90s and into the 2000s, when he comes into the Obama administration, he's a lot more skeptical of intervention. So he argues against the surge in Afghanistan, and he says he doesn't want to do the war in Libya, which is a complete disaster. He also is skeptical of Obama's decision to assassinate bin Laden, which itself is, lots of cascading negative effects, not really any positive effects other than getting Obama reelected. And so that stuff is good, but again, he doesn't really have an impact. Despite being Obama's closest foreign policy advisor, he's not able to change his view. Probably his most lasting legacy on Obama's foreign policy is this idea of the counterterrorism plus idea, which is basically that became Obama's national security strategy. It was the combination of special forces strikes and drone bombings and basically not putting boots on the ground, but having a military presence in all these various countries sprinkled around, where you could come in and just sort of do these, illegal strikes and kill people that you didn't like and come out. And of course, this is terrible during the Obama administration because it pisses off a lot of people in the Middle East, obviously, as you can imagine. When your friends and family are zapped from the sky by robots, it doesn't tend to engender a lot of goodwill and tends to actually feed terrorism. But it's also had cascading effects beyond that, where you see with Trump inherited this national security plus, this counterterrorism plus strategy, and and the next president will inherit it, and unless that's curbed, the next president will inherit it. And even if you thought Obama was a responsible steward of this strategy, that he could be trusted to sort of pick which terrorists could die any one day, and I would argue you shouldn't trust anyone to be able to do that. But even if you did trust them, the fact is Trump inherited it, and we're already seeing the potential calamities that can come from that when he assassinated Soleimani, which is from the drone program. There's no limits on this. It's entirely just up to the president to decide when he wants to do this. So that's probably his lasting legacy, is that the world narrowly avoided a war between Iran and the US. If Trump gets reelected for another 4 years and he still has Obama's counterterrorism strategy, we may not be so lucky. But, yeah.
Do you get into the book just kind of like his lying, like his first campaign where he has to drop out because he just takes a life story of what Irish Bowl?
Oh yeah.
And now he's got a new one about Nelson Mandela and.
We backtracked on that today.
Oh, did he? Okay, really good. Well, see, Biden today, I don't know whether he's honestly lying or if he is just genuinely confused and doesn't know what his own is. Honestly, and now I don't know. But yes, he has a propensity for lying. Despite, I mentioned that thing, he said, I want to run on my honesty, and that's a big part of his whole persona for a long time, is that he's going to tell you what he thinks, and screw it if it makes him unpopular and you don't like it, but he'll tell how it is, and it doesn't matter, and he'll say things that liberals won't say and that kind of thing. It's part of a big part of his whole shtick. But of course, he's very selective with which audiences he says he tells what. So, for example, in the 1972 campaign, 1978 campaign, he gets an endorsement from a businessman called Howard Jarvis, who is this, who's one of the businessmen who backed the Proposition 13. Yeah, that's right. And he gets a letter of endorsement from him, and his office releases a statement saying, we're delighted to have this endorsement. Not exactly a good look for a New Deal liberal. Then that same election campaign, he's speaking to a mostly black audience, and he tells them, this Proposition 13 thing in California is terrible, terrible. Somebody says, well, didn't you get an endorsement from Howard Jarvis? And he says, well, I can't help who endorses me. And he does this again during the Iraq War, after spending the entire year, 2002, pushing for the Iraq War, and he votes for the Iraq War in October. He then goes to, the next month, he goes to a meeting of African-American columnists. He's speaking to them, and the Iraq War was heavily opposed by African American voters, and I think Biden realizes this, and he said, he presents himself as a completely different politician. He says, "Oh no, I didn't think that this isn't going to lead to war. I don't actually want war. War's terrible. This is a very dumb war. Hopefully we're going to get out of this without going to war." Completely the opposite of what he's been saying for the past 12 months. And you're right. So in '87, there's a series of lies that he's caught out in that end up losing him that right. Well, not losing him. I mean, he drops out before they even starts. One of which is about his life story. He plagiarizes his own family history from Neil Kinnock, which is appropriate because Neil Kinnock in the UK was another kind of right-wing Labour politician who was trying to push the Labour Party to the right. So there's some symmetry there. But then what else does he lie about? He claims for years, just in the anti-war marcher stuff, he claims that he was a civil rights activist. He's saying that again now, for God knows why. Maybe because maybe he really believes he was at this point. At the time, he knew he wasn't, and he said for years that he was involved in the civil rights movement, that he came out of the civil rights movement, so on and so forth. Eventually, reporters, work out that this isn't true, and they confront him about it, and he has to say that, I was not in the civil rights movement. The only thing I did was I worked as a lifeguard on an all-black swimming pool on the east side of Wilmington. And so that was my civil rights experience, And he also at one point says that he when he was in school, him and his friends, they went to a diner, I think, or a restaurant with it was a theater, maybe a theater with there's food involved though, so I think it might have been a restaurant. There's another one. I think he maybe picked it at a theater. I think maybe that was some of his civil rights activism, but that was the extent of it.
One of his classmates was on a sports team.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
was asked to leave a diner, and the story is that we all supported our friend.
Yeah.
It's a little bit of a dubious story.
Yeah.
It's not exactly a civil rights protest.
No, well, even so, the Philadelphia Inquirer talked to that student who was a doctor by that point, and he said, he said no, Biden wasn't like a racist or anything, but they had no idea I was even kicked out. They finished eating, and then they all realized afterwards. Then there's this whole, the stuff we're seeing now, he's insulting voters and being angry at them and sort of exploding. That was really what led to the end of his campaign in '87, because it was the final nail in the coffin, basically. Somebody dug up a piece of footage from, I think, April of that year, where he was speaking to a voter, and a voter just asked a very innocuous question, just asked, where did you come in your class? And Biden said, I guess he took this as a slight against his intellectual capabilities, and was like, well, I think I'm a lot smarter than you. If you want to take an IQ test and have to do that, I came top of my class, I won scholarships, this. And then not only obviously is this clip a very bad look, but then reporters look into it, and it turns out he had actually plagiarized one of his papers that he had done. Secondly, he did not come top of his class, he came near the bottom of his class. He did win a scholarship, but it wasn't a merit-based scholarship, as he claimed. It was partly a means-based scholarship, which is fine, no shame in that, but different from what he was arguing. And then that's probably the thing that makes him go, okay, I'm leaving the race, because all this happens in about 3 weeks or maybe even a month. Just this string of stories. So yeah.
Just today, he seems to have said that he worked with Deng Xiaoping to negotiate the Paris Climate Accord.
Oh,
Debate.
okay.
Oh, that's the date.
Right. I mean, yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure the veracity of that, but yeah, I mean,
Well,
obviously, I
Doug
don't think
died
he was.
in
Oh, you mean? Oh, you actually mentioned the premiere from like
Yeah.
from 80s. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So well, it's the same way as he called Theresa May Margaret Thatcher.
Yeah.
Right.
and
So,
told the rally he was running for the U.S. Senate.
right. Yeah. So again, I mean, yeah, even beyond his terrible record, and I think the sort of impulse to kind of fight right-wing extremism by adopting parts of it, even just as a debater and as a being able to fulfill the functions of a candidate, I think Biden's sort of showing that he's not really up to the task. Anyone else? Yeah.
Are you surprised that he's sort of doing better this time than he's done before?
Well, I mean, define doing better. I mean, he's doing better in the sense of yes. I mean, the low bar of dropping out before you even get to a primary and getting fifth with 0.9% of the vote in Iowa. You know, it's not exactly a tough bar to clear. So he is doing better, but he's also doing. I mean, for the narrative that we've been fed for the past year, which is that he is the most electable, he's the most solid, he's the most dependable, all this stuff, he's the strongest candidate. He has done amazingly badly, and particularly, I mean, he may well do well and win South Carolina. We'll see. He's still competitive there. He did beat Sanders among black voters in Nevada. But I mean, part of his whole selling point is that he's the guy who can win over these white blue-collar voters that might have gone to Trump, or even just white, suburban voters that might have gone to Trump. That's his whole shtick, is that that's why he's electable. He can appeal to these people. Apparently, he couldn't do it in Iowa and New Hampshire. So, yeah. Am I surprised? I am a little surprised. I thought he would do a little better than this. I didn't think he would lose to Buttigieg and Klobuchar, for example. The second in Nevada, makes sense to me. But that I'm really surprised about. But yeah, I wouldn't count him out. Yeah, I'm not just saying that because I want to push book copies, but there's a possibility he'll be around for a little while in the race. Any other questions?
So my question is a bit different. So why did you start studying on Biden? I mean, yeah, it seems like you have not very positive views about him. So usually, people study other people, whom they like, So it's very nice and interesting. So I just wonder how this journey started.
Right. Yeah. Well, I'll say journalists are the exact opposite. We study the people that we don't like because we want to find out about them and sort of show people, the histories that maybe people aren't aware of. With Biden, I honestly did not know that much about his record. I knew about the tough on crime stuff, and I knew about the busing stuff back in 2015. But beyond that, I didn't really know that much about him. Other than there was a lot of stuff with Obama's domestic and foreign policy that he was involved with that I didn't like. But beyond that, not really much. And in 2018, he was very clearly positioning himself to run. He was doing speeches and sort of hinting that he was going to end up being a 2020 candidate. And I had already by that point done a bunch of pieces that looked at various different candidates, Kamala Harris, Kristen Gillibrand, and some other people like that, kind of looking at their records and sort of showing how they had shifted from being much more on the conservative side of things to suddenly becoming these kind of progressive firebrands. And so Biden was the next logical choice. So this guy, he has he's been in the Senate for 36 years. He has a huge record. It'll be interesting to go back and see what he was about. So I wrote this series of pieces for Jacobin magazine, which is what I work for. Over the course of 2018, did it pretty well. People seemed to enjoy them. People learned a lot of stuff. I learned a lot of stuff. And then when 2019 came, Biden was gearing up to run, and a friend of mine was, said to me, well, why don't you write a book about him? Yeah. And I was like, at first I was kind of like, nah, he won't be a candidate. He won't be very good. He'll flame out. I was obviously very wrong, and shows you everything about political predictions. But I decided, that would be worth a worthy thing to do, because there would be a lot more to look at and sort of investigate that I hadn't looked at before, that I hadn't included in those original pieces, and also if he's already running and if people are going to be voting for him, they should know what they're voting for instead of just sort of they're voting for that kind of smiley Uncle Joe figure that has become popular. So really, it was about May or June 2019 that I started writing, researching and writing the book, and then somehow managed to get it done, just in time for I guess the primaries.
Yes, thanks.
Let's go.
This question about Biden's black support. Much of what I've read, it seems to be very generational.
Yeah.
But and along that line, I don't know if you've encountered this, but what I'm hearing from a lot of young blacks I know and a few black writers is that a lot of that support among older blacks, when you is a combination of Obama adjacency and a sense that, oh, this is the type of Democratic politician that they think racist whites will vote for. It's not really sort of support. Again, it's that sort of sense of, oh, we're going to vote for him because we think someone else likes him.
I think that's about right. It's that idea of electability. Biden, the idea that Biden is the most electable, that he can win over the Trump voters. That's the case he's made, and that's MSNBC. I did a study on this for these times, which you can look up. I looked at, I believe it was August and September, the MSNBC coverage of or at least the top three candidates at that time, so Sanders, Warren, Biden. And this was just pushed relentlessly by MSNBC. It's just like, well, the polls show that he's the strongest, and so therefore he's the strongest. And there's very little discussion of policy or any of his really record. Anything disquieting that would come up often was just sort of undercut by the hosts, who were just sort of, not all the hosts, I don't want to paint every one of them like that, but certainly people like Chris Matthews and Brian Williams. And that's what a lot of voters were just being fed. It's just, he's electable, he's the strongest, go for him, he'll win over those voters that went for Trump. And I think, but I think people are slowly waking up to the fact that that's not really true. Obviously, those losses in Iowa and New Hampshire, I think, you saw his support even among older African Americans start to drop. And it's not just African Americans. This is, I think, older voters in general. Older voters, just like Biden's generation of politicians, that lived through the Reagan era and were sort of like, oh God, we can't be liberals anymore. We have to do what Reagan's doing. Those voters took away the same lessons, which is that for them politics is still stuck in the 80s. It hasn't really shifted. So, but it seems like people may be coming around to things. We'll see what happens in South Carolina. I think that'll be the big. I'll just go.
You alluded to some kind of a disagreement between Obama and Biden over Bin Laden.
Yeah, well, Biden reportedly
about
wasn't. He advised Obama not to kill Bin Laden, and Obama decided to. Again, the Bin Laden killing is this thing that's celebrated as if it was VJ Day. It has no impact on anything. The war on terror was not slowed down or impacted in any way by the killing of Bin Laden. Bin Laden was completely irrelevant. There's an old man in a basement looking at porn and watching movies. That's all he was doing. If there was any sort of effect, the one effect, well, there's two. One, like I said, it got Obama reelected because he was able to say, I'm the tough commander-in-chief who killed hated enemy. And two, it undermined the effectiveness of vaccine programs in places like Pakistan.
But what did Biden want to do?
He didn't want to kill.
What did he want to do?
I don't know, maybe capture him or go through Pakistan and see if Pakistan had him. The Pakistan would have never handed him over because they didn't want to seem like they were betraying Bin Laden. But yeah, I think his advice was, because if it went wrong, and it very nearly did go wrong. They pulled it off, but it could have very easily gone the other way. So yeah, I don't know the exact thing that Biden, what his alternative was, but I would suspect that that's what it was. So you had a question?
Yeah. How did he? You say he supported Glass-Steagall.
Yeah.
How did he explain that to his middle class supporters?
This is the repeal of Glass-Steagall.
Yeah, the repeal of Glass-Steagall.
Repeal, that's what I meant.
Yeah, honestly, there wasn't really. I looked around through all the newspaper archives and stuff to see if to find something about him saying anything about this. And honestly, the vote really wasn't really remarked upon that much. We look back on it now as this really significant event that ultimately, from the vantage point where we are now, where in the shadow of the 2008 crisis, we see it as this really significant thing. But I think at the time, it was just sort of, it came at the very end of Clinton's terms. It was just sort of, one more vote.
Very
It was kind of
bipartisan
Yeah.
support, I remember.
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah. And it was pushed by Robert Rubin as well, who was the city. And at the time, Robert Rubin. So there was a merger between these two banks, and Robert Rubin was in talks to become an executive of Citibank, which came out of this merger, and that merger would have been illegal under Glass-Steagall. But the Glass-Steagall Act allowed, I think, there was some sort of window, it was a grace period where you could do a merger and then it wouldn't be reviewed for a while. So basically he pushed this in the Clinton administration, and then it was passed, Glass-Steagall repeal was passed, the merger was allowed to go on, and Robert Rubin went on to head that bank. So, and Robert Rubin also, incidentally, during the 80s was part of the kind of right-wing, the corporate, at least, campaign to push the Democrats to the right, spending a lot of money. How is he? I don't know if he's been challenged on it since. So that, that's a good question. That might be something to look into. But I didn't really see anything where he's really had to talk about it. Any other questions?
Thank you.